The morning Mr. Aldrich Drummond came to call, Cecily had her hands inside a linen press, counting sheets. It was a thing she had learned to do in the 2 years since she had taken up residence in Lady Prudence Wentworth's establishment in Bath, this finding of tasks that required her full attention and occupied her hands, so that when conversation turned toward her situation, she could meet it with the expression of a woman already engaged elsewhere. She had become very good at counting sheets. Lady Prue's sitting room was warm with October light, the fire freshly laid by a girl named Nan, who was 17 and afraid of her own shadow, and who had been comforted that morning by a quiet word from Cecily about the housekeeper's bark being worse than her bite. The room smelled of bergamot and dried lavender. Mr. Drummond smelled of pomade and a certain confidence that had no particular reason to announce itself. He was 44 years old, a widower with a prosperous estate in Wiltshire, and an almost visible eagerness to fill the space his first wife had occupied. He had been introduced to Cecily at 2 separate evening parties over the preceding fortnight, and both times he had looked at her in the way of a man mentally measuring a room for furniture. She had not encouraged him. Lady Prue, who was fond of Cecily in the specific way one becomes fond of a useful and quiet presence in one's house, had encouraged him quite enough for both of them. Miss Hartwell, Ter and Einian, Bir Heinian. He came to the point with the directness of a man accustomed to transactions. He had spoken to Lady Prue's cousin, Mr. Brecht. Fenwick, he said, who had spoken to Lady Prue herself, and all parties were in agreement that a woman in Cecily's position would benefit greatly from the security of a second establishment. He was prepared to offer it. Cecily set down the sheet she was folding. She was not surprised by the offer. She was surprised, faintly, that it landed with so little weight, that a proposal of marriage, the thing she had understood since girlhood to be the whole organizing principle of a woman's life, could sit in the middle of Lady Prue's warm sitting room and mean almost nothing to her. She thought, for one involuntary moment, of a different room. A study at Ashmore Hall 2 winters past, the light slanting long through the south-facing windows. She turned to face him fully. "You are very kind, Mr. Crans." "Drummond," she said, her voice steady in the way she had trained it to be, "I must decline." Lady Prue, who had remained in her chair by the window under the pretense of reading, looked up with the expression of a woman who has been defied by furniture she considered perfectly cooperative. Cecily. One word, carrying the full weight of reasonableness. "I am not able to accept." Cecily kept her gaze on Drummond, who received this information with the blinking confusion of a man who had not packed a contingency for it. "The reasons are my own. I am grateful for the honor." It was only afterward, when Mr. Cant. Drummond had been seen downstairs with the dignified puzzlement of a man who could not identify where the negotiation had failed, that Lady Prue set aside her book and asked the question that had been sitting between them since he arrived. "There is something you have not told me." Cecily stood at the window, watching the street below. A woman in a gray pelisse was walking a terrier that refused to walk straight. The October sky was the particular shade of pale silver that meant rain before evening. "I do not know that the papers were real," Cecily said. She had never said it aloud before, not to anyone. It felt strange in the room, like a piece of furniture moved from its usual place. "I signed nothing. I am certain of it. The solicitor, Mr. Graves, told me afterward that my signature was there. I was not myself that week. Fully myself, I mean. My father had died 10 days prior. I cannot account for those days with any certainty." Lady Prue said nothing for a long moment. From the corridor below, someone said something sharp to Lady Constance Fawcett, who had arrived uninvited with Mr. Drummond, and had waited in the downstairs parlor for precisely this outcome, and Lady Prue's ears sharpened toward it. Lady Constance's voice rose just enough to be audible, carrying the particular precision of a woman who knew exactly how far sound would travel. "The discarded wife," she said to someone Cecily could not see. One could hardly expect her to know her own mind. The words arrived in Cecily's chest like a small cold stone. She had heard it said before, in various shapes, by various people. She had learned to receive it with her face arranged and her hands still. She received it now the same way. She wondered, not for the first time, what Edmund had told his mother when he came home from the continent to find his marriage dissolved. She wondered what his face had looked like when he read the papers that bore her name. She had been wondering that for 2 years. Edmund Ashmore had married Cecily Vane in the early spring of 1820, when she was 21 and he was 29, and the world was still organized in the way that she had been taught to expect it to be organized. Her father had been a country clergyman of modest living and considerable learning, who had given his only daughter a Frenchwoman's education and a genuine feeling for mathematics, and who had died of a sudden fever in January of 1821, leaving Cecily with a house she could not afford and no near male relatives to whom the living might pass. The marriage to Edmund had been sudden in the way that good things sometimes are. He had met her in the library of a mutual friend, had argued with her about the enclosure debates for 40 minutes without appearing to notice that she was a woman he was supposed to be deferring to, and had called the following morning. She had not expected to love him. She had not expected much of anything beyond the relief of a situation, secured a roof that was hers by right, rather than by sufferance. She had loved him anyway. Quickly and entirely, and with the particular helplessness of a woman who has learned to manage her own life and finds herself unable to manage this. Edmund had been called to the continent in October of 1820, a diplomatic appointment, arranged by connections he had in the Foreign Office, and he had gone with the expectation of returning in 4 months. He had been detained until the following November. Cicely had spent those 13 months learning Ashmore Hall, learning its staff, learning its particular rhythms and needs, and writing letters that traveled south and came back to her shorter than she had sent them, as though the distance compressed everything. The solicitor, Mr. Graves, had come to her in December of 1821, 3 weeks after her father's death and 10 days before Christmas, and had set a document before her on the table in the small room she had been occupying at her cousin's house in Surrey. He had told her that the Earl of Ashmore, through his legal representative, was seeking an annulment on grounds she did not need to concern herself with, and that he required her signature on several papers to confirm her consent. She had not signed them. She remembered it still with the clarity that sharp cold produces in memories. She had said no. She had said she would need to write to Edmund first. She had said she did not understand what grounds there were for the application, and that no solicitor of hers had been consulted. She had been, in the ruin of her grief, nonetheless perfectly clear on these points. Mr. Graves had returned 2 days later to tell her that her signature had already been provided, in the matter now concluded, and that he was sorry for her loss. She had no copy of anything. She had the memory of her own refusal. She had, since that day, carried both of these things with no means of knowing which one would prove to be the truth of her life. Lady Prue had listened to all of it after Mr. Drummond left, sitting very still in her chair by the fire, and had said at the end, with the quiet authority of a woman who has made a decision, "We are going to London for the Wentworth season." It was not, Cecily thought, how she had expected the conversation to conclude. She saw Edmund for the first time in 2 years on a Thursday evening at the Wentworth house in Brook Street, and she saw him before he saw her, which gave her perhaps 6 seconds of advantage that she used entirely to continue breathing. He was standing at the far end of the drawing-room, near the terrace doors that overlooked the garden, in conversation with a man Cecily did not recognize. He wore a dark coat fitted close at the shoulder, a white cravat, and the same quality of contained attention that she had fallen in love with in that library 3 years ago, that particular stillness of a man who was always aware of more than he said. He had not changed in any way she could clearly identify, except that his face in profile had sharpened somehow as though 2 years had rendered it to its essential elements. She looked away. She fixed her gaze on Lady Prue's fan, which was ivory and required immediate study. He saw her 12 minutes later. She knew the moment, because the quality of the room changed in a way she could not have explained to anyone who had not already experienced it. A subtle shift in the atmosphere near her left shoulder, as though the air had been asked to make room for something. She did not look up. She was speaking to Mrs. Fellows about the merits of bath water and she finished the sentence. And then she looked up, because not looking would have cost more than looking. He was 20 feet away. His gaze was on her face with an expression she could not read from this distance and could not have read at any distance because it was one of his, the kind that operated below the surface of his face rather than on it. He did not move toward her. He did not look away. Lady Prue appeared at Cecily's elbow with the timing of a woman who had been watching the door. "He has just come back from a sitting with Fenwick," she said, low, her fan moving steadily. "Some business about the Ashmore estate papers. I am told he arrived in London last week." Cecily said nothing. "He looks," Lady Prue said carefully, "as though he has not slept well in some time." Cecily looked at the fan. The ivory was carved with a pattern of climbing roses that she had never examined carefully before. She examined it now. "I would like some air," she said. She went to the opposite end of the room, where a small table held glasses of orgeat and a bowl of winter roses past their prime, and she stood there until her pulse was a thing she could no longer hear, and she did not look across the room again that evening. She was aware, with the particular peripheral awareness of a body that knows where another body is, that he remained in the room for another 40 minutes before he left, and that in those 40 minutes he did not approach her, and that he did not speak to Lady Constance, who had not been expected and was standing near the door with the expression of a woman who had arrived at a scene and found it slightly ahead of schedule. In the days that followed, Edmund Ashmore demonstrated a talent for appearing in places where he had no obvious reason to be. He appeared at the lending library in Duke Street on the Monday morning when Cecily was returning a volume for Lady Prue. And he was at the counter before she reached it, and he said good morning with the precise neutrality of a man practicing it. And she said good morning with the precise neutrality of a woman practicing it in return. And their hands were both on the counter for a moment when he slid a book toward the attendant, and the distance between their fingers was perhaps 3 inches, and she was aware of those 3 inches as though they had a temperature. The attendant, a young man who catalogued with the focused indifference of someone paid to see books and not people, asked them both whether they required assistance. Edmund said no. Cecily said no. They were standing perhaps 18 inches apart in a narrow aisle, the shelves of bound volumes close on either side, and the light from the street window fell on the counter and made the dust motes visible and made the space between them more particular than it had any reason to be. She could see, without looking directly at him, that his jaw had its habitual set, and that his hands, now free of the book, were still on the counter edge, and that he had not moved away. She took the volume for Lady Prue and turned to go. "Cecily." She stopped. He had used her given name, not her surname, not her title, and the sound of it in his voice, low and very level, was the sound of a door that had not been opened in 2 years being touched at the handle. She turned back. "I am sorry," he said, "for what was done to you." He paused. He was the kind of man whose pauses meant something, who left space not from uncertainty, but from an unwillingness to fill the air with anything less than what he meant. "I did not know. I want you to understand that I did not know." She looked at him for a moment. She believed him. She had believed him, in some part of herself, for 2 years, and had not been able to afford what that belief required. "I know that now," she said. He held her gaze. Had. Something moved in his face far enough below the surface that she could not name it, but her body understood it before her mind gave her the language. Her pulse was audible in her throat. Her hand on the borrowed volume was very still. She looked away first. She had to. He appeared at the Hartley garden party on the Wednesday, which Cecily had attended because Lady Prue had a mild headache and required the company. And he was on the far side of the garden near the rose arbor when Cecily arrived, and moved to the opposite side perhaps 20 minutes later, which was either coincidence or calculation, and she found herself entirely unable to determine which. At the garden party, a woman she did not know, a Mrs. Baugh, Alderton from Devon, someone's cousin visiting the season, tilted her head slightly and said with the pleasant curiosity of someone who believes they are asking a neutral question, "You were the first Countess of Ashmore, were you not?" The one who left. It was not quite a question, it was the label the season had settled on, the compression of a story they had decided they understood. a woman who had departed a good marriage and taken herself to Bath, which was where women who had made poor choices came to manage the consequences at a reduced rate. She was the one who had left. That was the narrative shape they had assigned her, and it had been sitting on her back for 2 years. "I came to Bath," she said. Yes. She did not add the rest. She had long ago stopped adding the rest. Edmund had appeared somewhere to her left during the exchange. She did not know how long he had been there. She knew only that when she turned to find Lady Prue, he was within earshot, and that his jaw had done something small and controlled that she remembered from the way he looked, when something had been said that he disagreed with, and did not intend to dispute in company. She found Lady Prue. She did not look back. 3 days after the garden party, Edmund arrived at a Wednesday afternoon call at the Wentworth drawing room for the 3rd time in a week, and on this occasion Lady Prue contrived to be briefly occupied at her writing table, which left Edmund standing near the fire and Cecily seated near the window, with no immediate means of escape and no particular reason to pretend she needed one. "You are comfortable in London," he said. It was not a question. It was one of his statements shaped like a question, the kind that meant he was looking for something underneath the answer. "Adequately," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Lady Prue speaks well of your company. I am glad of it." A pause that had a shape to it, a structure. The fire moved. A coal settled. "There is something I require you to know," he said, and the specific construction of the sentence, not "I wish to tell you," not "I think you should know," but "require." The word "a small, blunt instrument" brought her eyes up to his face. "When I returned from the continent," he said, his voice set very low and level, "I was told that you had sought the annulment, that the application had been yours." The room contracted around her. She said nothing for a moment. She understood that this was information he was giving her. Not an accusation, but the words were in the air between them now, and they occupied considerable space. "I was told," she said, when she had command of her voice, "that it had been yours." The fire crackled. Lady Prue's pen moved at the writing table with great and deliberate focus. Edmund's face did something she had never seen it do before. It went very still, and then it went more still, the way water goes still before it freezes. "I see," he said after a long moment. "Yes," she said. It was several days after this that Lady Prue described to Cecily the scene she had witnessed at the Wentworth party, the one that had occurred while Cecily was engaged with Mrs. Alderton. Edmund Fawcett, Earl of Ashmore, had stood at the edge of that garden party and watched a stranger tell his wife she was known to the season as the woman who had left him. What she had not described until now was what had occurred 2 days before that, on the Monday morning at the Wentworth house, when the housekeeper, Mrs. Oakes, had come to Lady Prue's drawing room in visible distress. One of the junior footmen had been accused by a visiting gentleman's man of having taken a small sum from the coat left in the entrance hall. The accusation was loud enough to carry up the stairs and into the drawing room where Cecily had been reading. And Edmund, who had called that morning on a matter of the Wentworth estate, had been still at the door to the hall when it began. Cecily had gone downstairs before Lady Prue could intervene. She had spoken to the footman, a boy of 17 named Peter, whose honest panic was evident in the way his eyes moved, and she had spoken to the accusing manservant, and she had asked 3 questions with the methodical directness of a woman who had run an estate and knew the difference between a person lying and, by the end of it, had been quite certain which the boy was. She had said so plainly, to the manservant and to the gathered staff, and the matter had resolved itself without further noise. She had not known Edmund was in the doorway behind her until she turned to go back upstairs. He was watching her with an expression she had not had the presence of mind to analyze before she looked away and climbed the stairs. She had simply filed it, as she filed most things that cost too much to examine immediately, in the part of herself that kept track without knowing it was keeping track. Lady Prue, who had observed everything from the landing, had told her afterward, in a tone of careful understatement, that the Earl of Ashmore had stood quite still in that doorway for what she considered an unusually long period of time before he took his leave. What she had not described, until this later conversation, was what she had seen on the Wednesday call 3 days after, when Edmund had risen to take his leave, and his coat had fallen open briefly at the breast, and the object that had been in his inner pocket had slipped partially free before he caught it with one hand and pressed it back. "It was a brooch," Lady Prue said. "Small seed. Pearls and gold work, I think. I could not see it clearly." Cecily's hand went to her throat, her mother's brooch. The one she had worn at the wedding, and left in the study of Ashmore Hall the morning she had been told to pack her things and go, because she had not been able to make her hands pick it up. She had looked at it for a long time, and then she had left it. She had told herself afterward that he had probably given it to some housekeeper's box of unclaimed things. She had not permitted herself to wonder otherwise. Lady Prue was watching her face with the expression of a woman who has made a calculation. "He is not the man who sent you away," she said. Cecily had known it, in the part of her that had never quite reconciled the annulment with the man she had observed for 8 months. She had known it, and she had had no means of proving it, and the not knowing had sat at the bottom of everything for 2 years, like something weighted. It was the following morning that Lady Prue came to Cecily's room, with the expression of a woman who has decided that information withheld, past a certain point, becomes unkind. The night had been a dinner at the Alderton house, which Cecily had not attended, and at which Lady Constance Fawcett had been present, and at which someone had mentioned, in a gathering of perhaps 20 people, that the Earl of Ashmore had been seen calling rather frequently at the Wentworth house in Brook Street, and Lady Constance had said, with the composure of a woman who speaks only what she considers to be the plain truth, that she supposed one could not prevent a man's curiosity about what had once been his, and that the first Countess of Ashmore, or rather the woman who had briefly occupied that position, was quite determined to make herself interesting again. The room, Lady Prue said, had received this information with the attention one gives to a correction from a primary source. "The whole of London," Lady Prue said with the flat precision of a friend who has decided that honesty matters more than comfort, "is now calling you, the woman Ashmore, rejected." Cecily sat with this for a long moment. The morning light came through the window of her small room, past the curtain that was a little too short for the frame, and fell on the floor in a rectangle that edged slowly toward the wall. She thought about Mr. Fawcett, Drummond, and the Wiltshire estate, and the comfortable, orderly absence of everything that currently felt as though it were happening to her. She thought about how much simpler it would be to let the season have its story, to accept the version of herself that required no correction, that did not necessitate anyone going back through old papers and finding what had been done in her name. She thought about the fact that she had said no to Mr. Graves's papers, that she remembered it with the clarity of a cold morning. She thought about the brooch. Stay with this story a little longer, if you will. There is still the matter of the paper that was never signed, and the woman who remembered her own refusal with complete clarity. It was Lady Prue in the end who found the thread worth pulling. She had a cousin who was a solicitor, a Mr. Josiah Fenwick, whose offices were in Gray's Inn, and whose reputation was built on the specific virtue of meticulous skepticism in matters of document. She knew this because she had hired him once, some years ago, to examine a will she suspected her late husband's brother of having improved upon, and he had confirmed her suspicion with the cheerful certainty of a man who genuinely enjoyed being right. She wrote to him on a Friday morning, asking whether he would be willing to receive a particular type of inquiry, and his reply arrived that same afternoon. He would. What happened next was not something Cecily had planned. It was something she did because standing still had become impossible. She had kept, from that December, 2 years ago, a single document. It was the notification letter from Mr. Rote, Graves informing her that the matter was concluded and that she no longer held the position of Countess of Ashmore. It was the only paper from the whole affair that bore his name and seal, and she had kept it in the same way one keeps a splinter after the wound has healed, because it is wrong that it should be lost. She brought it to Fenwick's offices on a gray Friday morning while Lady Prue waited in the carriage. She set the letter on his desk and told him, in clear and ordered sentences, the precise sequence of events, what Graves had brought her. What she had said, what he had told her, 2 days later, what her handwriting looked like, which she demonstrated in 3 lines on a sheet of foolscap he provided. Fenwick looked at the notification letter. He looked at her 3 lines on the foolscap. He said he would need to see the original papers, or a copy of them. If she could tell him where they had been filed, she could tell him. She had spent 2 years knowing exactly what she did not have. It was Edmund who had the original papers. He had obtained them 2 weeks prior, on the grounds that they bore his name, and had brought them to Fenwick himself. He had not said why, but Lady Prue had heard from her cousin that the Earl of Ashmore had come in with the air of a man in pursuit of something, and had asked Fenwick to tell him what the documents said, and what they did not say, and whether the signatures on them were consistent with what he knew of the parties. Fenwick had not yet completed that examination when Cecily arrived. He completed it the following Monday morning. He compared 3 documents. The first were the original annulment papers bearing the signatures attributed to Cecily Vane Fawcett and to Edmund Fawcett, Earl of Ashmore. The second was Cecily's 3 lines of demonstration handwriting. The third was a letter she had written to Edmund in November of 1821, which Edmund had retained. Fenwick looked at all of these for a long time. He was a deliberate man, which Cecily had already decided she found enormously comforting. "The signature attributed to you," he said at last, "is not consistent with your hand. Not in the letter formation, not in the pressure, not in the slope. I would not expect that consistency to change significantly under grief or distress, not to this degree." He turned to the other signature. "This one is perhaps more arguable. I would not stake my reputation on it being the Earl's either." He set down his pen. "Miss Hartwell," he said, and then corrected himself. "Lady Ashmore." The papers are, in my professional opinion, a fabrication. Edmund arrived at Fenwick's offices at 10:30 on the Tuesday, summoned by a note from Fenwick the previous evening. He was alone. He stopped in the doorway when he saw Cecily, who was seated in one of the 2 chairs arranged before Fenwick's desk. He looked at her for one unguarded moment. Lady Constance arrived at 11:15, having been sent for by Edmund directly, with a note that said only that there was a matter of the Ashmore estate papers that required her immediate attention. She was accompanied by Mr. Firsting. Drummond, whose presence she had apparently decided to make use of, and who stood behind her left shoulder with the expression of a man who had arrived at a social occasion and found it to be a courtroom. Lady Prue was already there, having accompanied Cecily. The office was not a large room. The morning light came in through one long window and fell across Fenwick's desk, across the papers laid out on it, across the 4 faces arranged in their various attitudes of calculation and composure. Fenwick explained the matter plainly, and without embellishment, as was his nature. He described the documents. He described the examination. He described the conclusions. Lady Constance's face, as he spoke, underwent the small and terrible adjustments of a woman watching a structure she has maintained for 2 years fail at its foundation. She said, when he had finished, that the examination was hardly definitive. Fenwick said evenly that he had taken the additional step of sending a copy of the documents and the handwriting samples to a colleague who had given evidence in 3 prior forgery cases before the King's Bench, and that colleague had concurred. Lady Constance said nothing. Mr. Drummond cleared his throat. He said with the tentative air of a man who was beginning to understand that the transaction he had been planning was built on land he did not own, that perhaps there was some confusion. Edmund turned to face his mother. Cecily had watched him enter the room. She had watched him receive Fenwick's account. She had watched his face, not because she was looking for permission, but because she had learned to read the specific way his face registered things it had not permitted itself to feel. And she was reading it now, with the fluency of someone who has had 2 years to study a language they could not speak aloud. He was not angry. He was something slower and more thorough than anger. He was the thing that comes after anger has been very carefully put aside. "I would like to know," he said to his mother, who held the pen. A long silence. "It was for the estate," Lady Constance said at last. Her voice was still composed, but it had lost a particular quality that had always been present in it. the quality of a person who has never been contradicted by anything that mattered. She had no family, no settlement worth naming, no connection of any use. You were on the continent. I made a decision. Edmund looked at her for a moment. You made a decision, he said, about my wife. Lady Constance said that a woman of no consequence with no means and no family, and here her gaze moved briefly to Cecily, was hardly the appropriate Countess of Ashmore. Cecily did not look away. She sat very still in her chair, near the window, her hands folded in her lap, her face arranged in the expression she had spent 2 years learning, quiet, present, without concession. He stopped before Cecily's chair. He was not standing over her in the way of a man issuing judgment. He was standing close in the way of a man who has been on the wrong side of a distance for 2 years, and is not willing to maintain it any further. She is my wife, he said, in a voice that carried to every person in the room without being raised. She has never been otherwise. 12 words, plain, procedural, irrevocable. The kind of sentence that does not leave room for amendment. Mr. Drummond quietly withdrew to the corridor. Lady Prue watched him go with the satisfaction of a woman whose estimation of a situation has been confirmed. Lady Constance's fan, which she had been holding throughout, lowered by 2 careful inches. Her face did not crumble. It did something more precise and more permanent. It recognized that the script had concluded differently than she had written it, and that she was a woman of sufficient intelligence to understand what that meant. Fenwick produced from the drawer of his desk 2 documents. The first was a formal declaration of the annulment's nullity, prepared on the grounds of fraudulent instrument. The second was a letter he had already written to the ecclesiastical court, requiring their records to be corrected accordingly. He offered them to Edmund. Edmund signed where indicated without looking away from Cecily's face. "If you wish," he said to her, his voice no longer carrying the room, "to return with me to Ashmore Hall, there is no obligation." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought of the brooch. She thought of the way he had stood at the edge of the garden party, with his jaw doing that particular thing. She thought of a study full of October light and the feeling of a woman arriving in a house that had not yet decided whether it was hers. "There is very little obligation," she said, "that I would call it." Something shifted in his face. It was not a smile, not precisely. It was the thing that precedes a smile in a man who has forgotten that his face knows how to make one. The days that followed were procedural in the way that large things, once decided, become procedural. There were letters written, records corrected, calls paid. There were conversations between Edmund and his mother that Cecily was not party to and did not require to be. She understood that Lady Constance was a woman who had been confidently wrong in a way that would take some time to fully account for, and that her accounting was between herself and her son, and that the scene that mattered had already occurred in a solicitor's office on a Tuesday morning. Lady Prue cried briefly, in the carriage on the way back to Brook Street, which she denied and which Cecily pretended not to have seen. Thomas Ashmore came back from school at the first week of December, and he arrived at Ashmore Hall on a cold Thursday afternoon, with mud on his coat and a tortoiseshell cat he had acquired somewhere along the route that no one could account for. He was 9 years old and had his uncle's gray eyes, and a forthright quality about him that suggested he had been thinking things over and would be happy to share his conclusions. He looked at Cecily for a moment, then at Edmund, and then at the cat, and said that if they meant to stay, they had better have rooms for all 3 of them, which Edmund said he believed could be managed. That evening before dinner, Edmund found Cecily at the window of the library, watching the first snow of the season fall into the garden below. The room smelled of wood ash and leather, and the particular cold that stone houses carry. In December, he did not say anything for a moment. He came to stand beside her at the window, and they watched the snow together, and it was the particular quality of a silence that does not need to be filled. He reached into his inner breast pocket and placed something small and cool in her hand. She looked down at it, the pearl and seed brooch, her mother's. The one she had left on the desk in this room 2 years ago, when she had not been able to make her hands pick it up. She had thought he had never even noticed it there. "I kept it," he said, "because it was yours." She looked at him. "I did not know how to return it," he said. "To a woman I believed had chosen to leave." The snow fell softly against the glass. Inside, somewhere, she could hear Thomas Ashmore's voice, and the cat's answering protest, and the sound of Nan, the housemaid, laughing at something in the corridor, and the fire settling in its grate with the small, comfortable violence of wood finding its final position. Edmund took the brooch gently from her hand and turned her by a light touch at her shoulder to face him. He fastened it himself at the hollow of her throat, his fingers careful at the clasp. And when he stepped back, she understood that this was the act that meant everything the scene in Fenwick's office had formally declared. She had been reclaimed, not from the world, but for herself, by the simple fact of someone who had kept what was hers. She put her hand briefly over his where it rested at her shoulder. He covered it with his other hand. Outside, the snow was deep enough now to cover the garden paths, and the night had settled around Ashmore Hall with the fullness of a thing, finally and properly restored to its place. If the weight of a woman's name, reclaimed against false papers, moved something in you tonight, leave a word below. It is a small thing, and it is welcome. That brooch sat at Cecily's throat every morning for the rest of that winter, and the winter after, and in the early spring when the garden paths cleared, and Thomas's cat began to lose its indoor temperament, and Edmund brought Cecily a letter from the ecclesiastical court confirming what was already true. She read it once and set it in the fire, because there was nothing in it she needed to keep. She already had everything the document said.